Good evening, everyone. I'm Robin Garrell, the president of the Graduate Center, and I have the great pleasure to welcome you to the 4th annual Dissertation Showcase. The idea of the showcase is to highlight the extraordinary work that our PhD students have done over the past several years. Their work is informed, sophisticated, innovative, consequential, and as you'll see, thought-provoking and inspiring. Completing a doctoral degree involves overcoming many hurdles. The students presenting tonight have taken on an additional challenge. They have aimed to take years of research and hundreds of dissertation pages, selecting and distilling their work into a 3-minute story created for a general audience. This year, 43 brave students submitted applications, and we had the very difficult task of choosing just 10 participants for tonight's event. I want to thank the selection committee made up of faculty and staff who read the submissions and chose the participants. The research our students will present spans disciplines from chemistry to music to criminal justice. You will hear why robots struggle with tasks that are easy for people, about the social mobility of Mexicans in New York, about bias in jury selection, and much more. The depth and range of scholarship like this and its public impact distinguish doctoral education at the Graduate Center. This year, for the first time, we will give a special prize to the student who is judged to be the most effective in communicating their work to the public, a key skill as they advance in their professions. At the close of tonight's program, I will announce the new Presidential Prize for Public Communication. Along with an honorarium given to each presenter, an additional $1,000 honorarium will go to the student judged the most effective communicator. We've assembled a distinguished panel of judges whom I'd like to introduce to you now. So judges, would you please turn on your cameras? I'll start with Brian Jones. He's the director of the new Center for Educators and Schools at the New York Public Library. He's the former Associate Director of Education at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, where he was also a scholar in residence. He's an alumnus of the Graduate Center, where he earned his doctorate in urban education, and he was a presenter at the very first Dissertation Showcase 4 years ago. His first book, based on his dissertation about the 1960s Tuskegee student movement, is under contract with NYU Press. Thank you, Brian, for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much. The CUNY Graduate Center is a home to me, so it's nice to be back even virtually, and I'm excited to celebrate these brilliant and innovative scholars.
Thank you. Joanna Migdal has served as a trustee of the Graduate Center Foundation for close to 10 years, and she's a great supporter of the Dissertation Showcase. She currently runs a financial consulting firm offering expertise to institutional and high net worth clients. Before her career in finance, she was a medical social worker and has done graduate work in both finance and social work at NYU. Joanna, we're delighted you're here.
I'm delighted to be here, and I thank you all for participating in this, in the more difficult situation of no live. But I'm very glad to be here with you virtually, and I'm eager to hear your research and its findings.
Thank you.
So thank you.
And finally, Daniel Porterfield is the president and CEO of the Aspen Institute, the global nonprofit organization committed to a just and equitable society. He previously served as president of Franklin and Marshall College. He is also an alumnus of the Graduate Center, where he earned his Ph.D. in English. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you. It's great to be here and to have a chance to hear the presentations. And congratulations to all of the students for completing your PhDs, which is really an incredible experience. One of the best days of my life was that graduation, and I'm really impressed with what you've all accomplished.
Thank you, judges. Would you please now turn off your cameras and mics? And everyone, now we're ready for the students' presentations. I'll just take a minute to explain how it's going to work. The presentations were recorded earlier, and we'll start them in just a moment. Following the last presentation, I will ask the students to join me here on Zoom for the live Q&A. You in the audience will be able to submit your questions in the Q&A box. If you do have a question, if possible, please name the person you're posing your question to. We'll figure it out if you don't, but that would help. And the chat will also be open for your observations. Are you ready? Our first presenter is Melanie Blair Thies from the Ph.D. program in psychology. Let's begin.
Imagine that you're ill. You go to your doctor, and after a single test, they easily determine the most effective medication for you. This is the goal of precision medicine, to individualize treatment by identifying biomarkers, such as genetics, brain activity, or blood type, to determine prognoses and design treatments. And it's the future. But there are potential pitfalls. For instance, lifestyle choices could interfere with the accuracy of the biomarker that just helped select your treatment. This could be alcohol, marijuana, or even the caffeine that gets you through work. These substances all influence the body, particularly the brain, in various ways. So, if we plan to use biomarkers in clinical practice, our research needs to account for the impact of such behaviors. And that's what my research is about. My research focuses on individuals with schizophrenia. Antipsychotic drugs have been the primary medication for this disorder, but whether a patient responds to them is highly variable, leading to delays in effective treatment for a vulnerable population. That's why a major goal of schizophrenia researchers is to identify biomarkers that predict upfront who will benefit from antipsychotics versus those who won't. However, as my dissertation argues, it's crucial for us to keep in mind that schizophrenia patients use marijuana at nearly 5 times the rate of healthy individuals. But currently, efforts to identify accurate brain-based predictors of treatment have ignored the potential for marijuana to interfere with the utility of such markers, even though marijuana is known to influence key brain connections related to treatment. To investigate this, I worked with researchers at Northwell Health on an existing study that used brain MRIs to predict antipsychotic treatment response in adolescents and young adults experiencing their first episode of psychosis. I used interviews and urine screening to evaluate patient substance use throughout treatment and whether that impacted the accuracy of the MRI biomarkers being studied. The results provided evidence that there's a potential interaction between marijuana use and brain activity in regard to treatment response. Specifically, our ability to use the connectivity between brain regions to predict treatment outcomes differ depending on the amount of marijuana used by patients. While there was no difference in the effectiveness of treatment as a result of marijuana use, our research suggests that some types of biomarkers may not be as accurate for patients who use marijuana. These findings highlight the importance of accounting for marijuana in research to establish treatment predictors, especially as legalization makes access much easier. More broadly, our results underscore how critical it is for the medical community to consider how lifestyle factors like substance use impact the predictive accuracy of biomarkers. By incorporating individualized data such as this into biomarker development, we can work towards a future where successful precision medicine allows any person to leave a doctor's office assured that their personal characteristics and daily behaviors have all been accounted for in their medical care. Thank you. And now, I'd like to pass it on to Serena Wang in the music program.
A Pulitzer Prize and an Oscar are just some of the high-profile honors bestowed upon contemporary Chinese émigré composers. My dissertation examines the rise of the first 2 generations of these Chinese composers in New York City and their practice of what I call musical transnationalism. I was born in the United States, but spent my formative years in Taiwan. Being part of the Chinese diaspora, I am deeply interested in East Asian culture and the diasporic literature. After arriving in New York City as a graduate student, I noticed how often Chinese émigré composers appear in the headlines of cultural and musical news, including the Metropolitan Opera's commission of Tan Dun's The First Emperor, which premiered in 2006. A significant number of Chinese composers got their start here in New York and maintain close ties with the city. Therefore, my dissertation is as much a story of New York City as it is a story of Chinese immigrant composers. In preparing my dissertation, I conducted archival research at the Columbia University Archives and interviewed past and present collaborators and administrators. The story begins with Zhou Wenzhuang's arrival in the US in 1946, his work as a composer and an administrator at Columbia, and his founding of the Center for US-China Arts Exchange in 1978 after China's disastrous Cultural Revolution. During his many trips to China, he also served as a talent scout and invited students from Beijing's Central Conservatory to study at Columbia. Zhou constitutes the first generation of Chinese composers in New York City, while his students make up the second generation. Among those that pursued postgraduate studies under Zhou at Columbia in the 1990s were Tan Dun, Zhou Long, Brai Sheng, and Chen Yi, all of whom participated in the city's diverse musical landscape. Chen Yi and Zhou Long collaborated with the Chinatown-based music ensemble Music from China. Tan Dun was active in the downtown experimental music scene, and Brai Sheng garnered international acclaim for his musical monuments memorializing the Cultural Revolution and the Nanking Massacre. I hope that my work sheds light on the importance of ethnic and cultural diversity in general, and Chinese immigrants' contribution to artistic innovations in the US in particular. Asian Americans have historically faced prejudice due to physical difference and continue to be treated as a domestic threat. Examples of this range from the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and recent attacks, both political and physical, on Asian American citizens. By establishing the mutual influence between Chinese immigrant composers in New York City, my dissertation challenges the notion of what is musically Chinese and what is Western, and works to transform the public perception of Chinese musicians and composers from voiceless exotics to agents of innovation. Now, I'd like to turn it to Jasmine Bayron from Earth and Environmental Science.
I'd like you to consider a question that's been posed by humans since time immemorial. How did life on Earth begin? My research approaches this question by focusing on the massive asteroids called planetesimals that delivered the building blocks of life to Earth. I found that these planetesimals formed earlier and are more sensitive to chemistry than previously thought. I first became interested in this research when I was an undergraduate student at Hunter College. I interned at the American Museum of Natural History and was able to work with real meteorite samples from their own collections, as well as NASA's Johnson Space Center. Because we've found organic molecules in meteorite samples, we know that planetesimals brought organic molecules and water to Earth. We've also detected organic signatures on the surfaces of asteroids in space. By combining computer modeling with microscopic meteorite sample analysis, I was able to reconstruct massive objects that were destroyed and no longer exist. Reconstructing a planetesimal is much like baking a cake. There must be strict attention to baking time, temperature, and ingredients. Here the temperature should be just high enough to melt ice, but low enough to preserve sensitive organic molecules that are the precursors to life. The ingredients are akin to the composition of the rock, which should be similar to meteorites that have retained the chemical fingerprint of the early solar system before planets formed. This research has led to two important conclusions that improve our understanding of the early solar system's history and the delivery mechanisms for the precursors to life on Earth. First, a planetesimal that is water-rich and around 44 kilometers in diameter would have formed around 2 million years before the first solids in the solar system. Some estimates put this formation age as far as 5 million years after the first solids in the solar system. So our estimate is earlier. Two, the temperature inside a planetesimal like this would be very sensitive to composition of the rock. In some models, there's only one ingredient that is considered. My model considers adjustments to both size, formation age, and associated adjustments to the composition of the rock. Based on these findings, the planetesimal that jump-started life on Earth was slightly larger than New York City and nearly as old as the solar system itself. Now I'd like to hand it off to Raj Korpin from Computer Science.
Imagine, one day you get into work and there's a robot there to take your things. You give it your bag, it turns and begins to make its way. While you watch it go, you're wondering, why is the robot there? Does the robot know how to navigate the building? And how can I be sure that it gets to my office? These are questions you likely wouldn't be asking if it was a person taking your things. As the robot makes its way, we'll see that it needs to learn about its environment and leverage that knowledge to make decisions. These are things that come easily to people, even at a young age, but are very difficult for artificially intelligent robots. My research takes its inspiration from neuroscience and psychology. It develops a system for robot navigation in large, complex, indoor environments. Since psychologists and biologists don't fully understand how people navigate, it's difficult for computer scientists to replicate that behavior in robots. Computers are good at well-defined tasks, like chess, because they predict every possibility and plan for it in advance. But for a task like navigation, the real world is uncertain and unpredictable. People quickly respond to an unexpected situation because they apply past knowledge and reason given a new context. When people encode spatial knowledge in their memory, they remove unnecessary details and generalize from few experiences. My research builds an AI system with human-inspired algorithms to represent spatial knowledge and memory. It uses short-term and long-term spatial reasoning and common sense to navigate. It also explains its behavior along the way, responding to questions like, why did you do that? The result is a more resilient robot navigator that flexibly adjusts behavior based on past knowledge. Here's an example where our robot Rosie's destination is far away, but without a map, Rosie doesn't know anything about this world. The real world is much more complex. This is the 5th floor of the Graduate Center. My system learns human-like representations, shown here as green circles, that allow Rosie to contend with errors in its sensors. Traditional approaches to robot navigation first map every inch of an environment, and then use that map to navigate. That approach is time-consuming and produces maps that quickly go out of date. And more importantly, people don't take the time to map every inch of environment, so robots shouldn't need to either. Instead, Rosie strategically explores the environment to learn its global structure. It then uses that knowledge to navigate far distances with relative ease. My system was evaluated in simulation in the Graduate Center, Hunter College, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Metropolitan Museum. The results show that Rosie efficiently navigates to over 90% of locations without any prior knowledge. Robots are proliferating throughout society, not just in office spaces, but in hospitals delivering medicine, in museums guiding tours, or in grocery stores stocking shelves. In the future, you might expect to have a full conversation with such a robot that adheres to social norms as it navigates in a crowd. Or eventually, you'll be able to tell a robot to go to the kitchen, take your lunch out of the fridge, and bring it back to you. While this reality may be a few decades away, my long-term goal is for robots to be our collaborators in everyday tasks. Thank you. Now I would like to turn it over to Jojo Carlin from the English program.
When was the last time you wrote a letter? Or received one? Not the deforesting deluge of mail from banks and charities, but a handwritten letter from a friend or to your mother. A year in domestic isolation has reminded us of our collective need to be in touch. But how, when for most of us, email, not to mention text messages and shared images on social media, have replaced letter writing? I began my research observing how, during World War II, my grandparents wrote to each other every single day to feel close when they were apart. I wondered what was actually happening between writing and receiving letters. In my dissertation, Yours sincerely, Virginia Woolf, Virginia Woolf's Poetics of Letter Writing, I wanted to look across one author's lifetime of letters to see what the letter meant to her. Woolf wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters, and I wanted to share what I saw pictured in her words. I persuaded my committee I could draw my dissertation to physicalize personal correspondence. In her novel Jacob's Room, Virginia Woolf writes, "Venerable are letters, infinitely brave, forlorn, and lost." Fortunately, Woolf's letters are neither forlorn nor lost, but fastidiously and comprehensively edited, many held at the New York Public Library. Their infinite bravery persists. What thrills me is how Woolf, as a woman and a writer, sustains friendship through gossip, casual impressions, and sharing or divulging projects and news. In each chapter, I explore a facet of Virginia Woolf's correspondence: the basics of epistolary form, letters' political power in her excoriating manifesto 3 Guineas, and the relationships of writers and lovers as they exist on paper. This is a dissertation about Virginia Woolf's letters, but it is also a dissertation about how and why I drew my dissertation. Knowledge exchange has always entailed more than just the exchange of words. Coming from the process-oriented digital humanities and textual and visual studies, I wanted to challenge the ways we convey our intellectual ideas. Drawing is how I read, so I argue through word and image. Today, we can share the world we see in an Instagram instant, but there is something in slow sharing. Working in pen and watercolor, handwriting Woolf's words beside my own and imagining her spaces of writing, I portray what letter writing had meant to her and her world of modernist artists and writers. I interpret how Virginia Woolf used letters to grow friendships, to meet people, and to develop her political principles. In closing a letter, Virginia Woolf would often tease with one last joke, recall a shared memory, or call you creature or mongoose. Yet, a letter never closed the conversation. It was always an invitation to keep writing, keep reading, keep trying to say the right thing in the right moment. When you leave your screen tonight and turn back to the space you've probably been in for the better part of the last year and a half, I hope you'll find some comfort in the fact that I'm sitting at just about the same distance from my screen recording this. As with a letter, I'm here on the other side, trying to reach you and sending you my sincere regards. I now turn it over to Roxana Piotrowska from the chemistry program.
If you ever seen a puddle of water disappear on a hot summer day, or PhD students' tears drying from their face, you observed a powerful energy transfer: water evaporation. Evaporation not only dries out puddles and tears, but it also delivers snow to mountains and fuel hurricanes. It is therefore an incredibly powerful source of energy. Since 71% of our globe is covered in water, the potential utility of harnessing power of water evaporation is huge. But how can we harness this evaporation energy? Well, we need materials that are able to transfer the energy of evaporation into mechanical motions. These materials are known as water-responsive materials, and they swell and contract in response to changes in humidity. I want you now to imagine that you walk through a forest on a hot summer day, and suddenly it starts to rain. You look around and you observe pine cones closing and spider silk shrinking. These are natural water-responsive materials. Although they are very powerful, they are also very complex, and their mechanics are poorly understood. So the idea of creating synthetic materials that are powered by evaporation sounded exciting and very challenging to me 5 years ago when I started my graduate program. But since I work at the Advanced Science Research Center, and one of my advisors is an expert in nanotechnology and another in evaporation energy, I thought I had a pretty great setup to give it a try. My goal was to create water-responsive material, understand how it works, and how it can be utilized to develop new ways of using evaporation to power movement. In my research, I work with simple chains of protein building blocks. Because they are simple, their properties can be tuned and optimized to form morphing structures powered by evaporation. After designing and trying several combinations of these building blocks, I noticed that a particular design was strikingly different than all the others. It formed large crystals, and when I placed them under the microscope, I observed that when the humidity was changed from low to high and the high to low, these highly organized structures, as you can see on the right hand of the slide, contract and expand. They are therefore water responsive. As long as the humidity changes, the material can swell and contract in infinite cycles. This repetition is crucial because it constantly takes the evaporation energy and transforms it into movement. By precisely studying them, I was able to identify the factors that control the movement of these structures. My work provides insight into mechanism of water responsiveness and can serve as design criteria to develop not only efficient actuators for energy harvesting, but also for soft robotics or artificial muscles. Thank you. Now I will turn it over to Virginia Diaz-Mendoza from Criminal Justice Program.
Have you heard of the school-to-prison pipeline? The school-to-prison pipeline illustrates how punitive school policies and practices can result in early involvement in the criminal justice system, particularly for students of color, Latinx students, Black boys and girls, students with disabilities, and LGBTQIA+ students who are disciplined more often, more harshly, and for less serious reasons than other students. Like many schools in the United States, New York City schools rely on exclusionary discipline such as suspensions and expulsions. Law enforcement officers on school grounds can also issue court summonses or arrest students. As a product of the City University of New York, I am deeply committed to public education and academic research that contributes to the public good. My research stems from a deep desire to make schools safer, more caring spaces where children can learn and educators can teach more effectively. Today, there are schools actively working to disrupt the school-to-prison pipeline through the use of restorative justice. Through my dissertation research, I wanted to decenter unjust disciplinary practices by turning my attention to the use of restorative justice in schools. Restorative justice focuses on healing and mending relationships through dialogue. Focusing on harms done and the needs of all persons involved in the harm, restorative justice promotes reconciliation and transformation. In 2016, the New York City Council invested $2.5 million to implement restorative justice in schools throughout the city. I traveled to schools located in all 5 boroughs to evaluate their implementation of restorative justice. Specifically, I wanted to know how educators shift from a punitive approach and whether they could implement restorative justice with fidelity. Participating schools used restorative practices to build community, mediate conflict, and address harms by facilitating circle practice, which encourages deep reflection and dialogue. Talking and listening circles come from indigenous traditions used for the purpose of peacemaking and celebrating in community. Circle practice helps each member of the community feel seen, heard, and valued. From my research, I learned how previously punitive schools shifted their practices to include a more holistic approach to student misbehavior. Participants shared that this paradigm shift requires a commitment to change, funding for training, and time. The use of evidence-based restorative practices reduced over-reliance on punitive discipline and improved school culture and climate. My findings suggest that in order to effectively implement restorative justice, educators need a deep understanding of how poverty and trauma impact the educational experiences of students and an increased awareness of how racialized bias and inequity influence discipline practices. New York City is committed to scaling up restorative justice initiatives by continuing to provide funding and training to its public schools. Now I'll turn it over to Guillermo Irizar Barbosa from Sociology.
I want to begin by introducing you to Familia Arias. They are a family of 4 who are active supporters and players of soccer in Queens. The father and husband, Claudio Arias, introduced me to foods I had not eaten before, such as lobster cream and kale salad. He and Marcela, the mother and wife, completed post-high school education in Tlaxcala, Mexico, learned English, and have a family income of over $80,000. They have multiple jobs at the same time in offices, restaurants, and private universities. They also open a carpentry shop. Their 2 kids talked to me about college, and the oldest one attended a graduate program. There was no hint that Claudio and Marcela were undocumented until one of their relatives made fun of me for not crossing the Arizona desert. Indeed, we cannot guess someone's immigration status just from their appearance or lifestyle. Since the 1990s, scholars have described the 11 million undocumented people on US soil as vulnerable, exploitable, marginalized, and with very limited prospects. Unauthorized status restricts social mobility, economic, political, and geographic mobility. However, my ethnographic fieldwork painted a complex picture. Over 2 years, I interview and follow up with more than 92 Mexican parents connected to a soccer team, a taco truck, and nonprofits in New York City and Long Island. Through this, I learned that when we look closely at their trajectories, there is significant variation in terms of social mobility. Unauthorized immigrants have been largely unrecognized and unappreciated for what they learned before emigrating or while working multiple jobs, raising children, and achieving social integration like the Arias family. Among those families who reporting earning less or under the federal poverty line, my research showed that nonprofits were crucial to avoiding downward mobility, socioeconomic hardships, arbitrary detentions, or deportations. Other optimistic stories of upward mobility against the odds were identified in families that received DACA, allowing them to defer deportation and to pursue their educational and labor trajectories. A central aim of my dissertation was to demonstrate that the Mexican immigrant community in New York, far from being homogeneous, hidden, or utterly powerless, is very diverse, active, and increasing their strength despite legal barriers. After speaking with these 92 families and multiple nonprofits, it is clear to me that their long-term stability and social mobility is contingent on much-needed immigration reform, but also linked to inclusionary policies for immigrants at the local level. The United States and Mexico must work together, offering legal chances and educational opportunities to million or hardworking human beings like Familia Arias. Muchas gracias. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Emily Ball from the music program.
When you think about classical violin music, what comes to mind? Perhaps you have experienced a polished performance of a virtuosic violin concerto at Carnegie Hall. Now consider what comes to mind when you think about fiddle music. Perhaps you think the violin and the fiddle are entirely different instruments, or associate fiddling with amateur performances in informal settings. In works like his second violin sonata, American composer Charles Ives bridged this perceived gap between classical performance and fiddling by quoting from famous fiddle tunes and musically imitating the fiddler's distinctive performing style. Several years ago, I programmed this sonata on a recital here at the Graduate Center, and I encountered what was, for me, a new and difficult challenge: convincingly expressing the spirit and style of fiddling music. Since I began playing the violin at 7 years old, my musical training was limited almost entirely to classical music, and so I had little practical experience with the fiddling genre. Furthermore, in my initial research on Ives, I noticed that existing literature about these sonatas often referenced the influence of country fiddling, yet lacked details about how to perform in this style. I sought to remedy this by conducting my own investigation into the characteristics of fiddle playing. This work culminated in a written performance analysis of the Second Violin Sonata that aims to help a classically trained violinist better embody fiddling style. In order to understand the differences between fiddling and classical violin technique, I studied articles and pedagogy books written by fiddlers, paying close attention to differences in posture, sound production, and how fiddlers choose bowings. Additionally, since fiddling is primarily an orally taught tradition, I listened to numerous recordings, paying specific attention to characteristics of the fiddler's sound and improvised elements such as melodic ornaments. This research informed my performance analysis of Ives's Second Violin Sonata, as I made recommendations and changes to help violinists capture the fiddler's performing spirit. Some of these changes include altered bowing patterns, added slides between notes, and pointing out Ives's allusions to an unrefined fiddling aesthetic, such as accidentally hitting the other strings of the violin. I hope my research about the performance of Ives's music encourages classical musicians to mimic the standards of the traditional music that he weaves into his works. My dissertation helps both performers and listeners broaden their ideas of what classical music is, to include this overlap of different musical styles, and thus develop appreciation for Ives's unique compositional voice. Now, I will turn it over to Natalie Gordon from the Psychology and Law program.
Most Americans, and even people outside of the United States, are now familiar with the name Derek Chauvin, the police officer recently convicted of the murder of George Floyd. In Chauvin's trial, many prospective jurors had seen video of the incident, unintentionally prejudicing them. Ultimately, the jury was comprised of individuals who said they could be fair and impartial, regardless of their knowledge about the case and any pre-existing attitudes. The process of asking jurors if they can be fair and impartial is known, funny enough, as juror rehabilitation. The expectation is that jurors who say they can be impartial will, in fact, be impartial in rendering a verdict, that is, not influenced by bias. This process is meant to safeguard defendants' constitutional rights to a fair and impartial jury. When I delved into the literature, I noticed that there were significant problems with the practice of juror rehabilitation. Most jurors were saying they could be impartial, and this struck me as inherently problematic. If jurors are feeling pressure to say they can be impartial, this by default means they are not accurately reporting their bias. Through my dissertation, I wanted to examine whether I could lessen some of the pressure to respond in the affirmative and, in turn, increase the accuracy of juror statements of impartiality. My research required several resources: mock judges, Confederate jurors, a mock courtroom, and nearly 500 participants recruited from 35 states, made available through the funding I received from the National Science Foundation. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, my study, much like our court system, transitioned online to Zoom video conferencing after a month of in-person data collection. I presented participants with real, prejudicial news articles about a defendant who had been accused of murdering his wife. Exposure to this type of information, also known as pretrial publicity, is a robust measure of bias because it makes jurors more likely to convict the defendant, which is exactly what I found in my study.
And what I also discovered, more importantly, was the majority of my participants said they could be impartial, and said they could be impartial even when they expressed bias during jury selection. That is, jurors admitted to having read news articles about the case, but still said they could be impartial. Even more concerningly, jurors who were biased were just as confident in their ability to be impartial as jurors who were unbiased. My results indicate jurors' expressions of impartiality are meaningless. Using jurors' expressions of impartiality as a metric for evaluating bias precludes defendants' constitutional rights to due process, can undermine the prosecution's ability to prove guilt, and can create additional litigation, thus wasting the court's invaluable time and resources. The court should reconsider the practice of rehabilitating jurors as a means of combating juror bias and explore alternative solutions. My main finding, that jurors cannot accurately report on their biases, has implications for varied social contexts, from the criminal justice system to schools, the workplace, and even our personal relationships. Thank you.
Fantastic. Congratulations to all of our presenters. I now invite all the students to join us for the Q&A, and we'll ask them to turn on their cameras and mics. To our audience, if you have additional questions, the Q&A box, I think, is still open, but I have questions for folks, so I'm going to just get the ball rolling, if that's okay. So maybe I'll start with Serena Wong. So you talked about second generation composers. The question is asking whether those individuals have continued the legacy. Are they bringing third generation folks to the US, or going back and forth to become agents of innovation?
Yes, for sure. There's actually a third generation, and I believe they're really well represented by Du Yun and Huang Ruo. And the second generation of Chinese composers, they're also, I think the ones I talk about in my presentation, they're all teaching at colleges and universities here. So yes, the legacy continues. Thank you.
That's fantastic. So the question for Virginia. So the question was, in the schools that you visited, did you sense that administrators were open to, and teachers, to learning and implementing the restorative justice techniques you talked about? And do you think that they'll be sustained now that they've mastered them to some extent and seen how they work?
I do think that they were interested and excited to learn restorative justice because it helped with their relationships among themselves, among the colleagues. So restorative justice also helped create a relational ecology in the schools. And in terms of sustainability, New York City is committed to continue the funding and the training. So I'm hopeful that more schools will engage in these practices. Right now, there are about 300 schools engaging in restorative practices in New York City. So that's pretty good.
That's a lot. That's amazing. Yeah. And is that a field you'll continue in as well?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Thank you. So stepping just a small step away, question for Natalie. So the question is, are there other judicial models maybe that have addressed the problem of juror bias, maybe that we could look to for solutions? So maybe from other countries or just other strategies?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the solutions that we've looked at in the United States, the research has shown that they largely do not work or can even backfire. There's a method being used in Canada called the challenge for cause procedure, which actually has other jurors evaluate a juror's ability to be fair and impartial, which is an interesting way to avoid self-report measures of bias. So that's certainly an avenue for future research.
Okay, thank you very much. Jasmine. So lots of interest in this little Planetesimals. So the question was about, do they vary widely in their form or in their stages, and what's the variability, and what's that look like?
Well, my numerical model that I made for my thesis was actually trying to get to that very question. We don't know what they look like. We kind of have the idea that at some point in the solar system's history, it was a ball of gas and dust. It collapsed, and that dust somehow went from tiny particles to kilometer-sized bodies. Some of them became planets. Some of them are broke apart and became asteroids in the asteroid belt. Some of them are basically natural steel, iron and nickel. And then some of them never even melted and are just as if you solidified the early solar system in a rock. So they actually vary widely, and they can tell us a lot of different things about how the solar system formed and early Earth.
That's cool. And are you going to keep going in this field?
Yes, I can't think of a question more important.
Fantastic. Well, you might be able to tell us a lot about the origins of the universe.
I hope so. Thank you.
So going back to our first speaker, Melanie. So, you've identified that there's this, conflating factor of a marijuana use. Others that sort of make it difficult to interpret the information that you would want to use to develop a personalized medicine strategy. Is there sufficient data or people working on collecting it that would enable maybe some modeling or some algorithms to compensate for that kind of recreational pharmaceutical use or self-medication?
Yeah, this is, there's actually less research going on about the impact of substance use on biomarkers than I would hope for, which is why my dissertation kind of focused on that. But certainly there's a lot of research being done on the impact of substance use on treatment outcomes. We just need to incorporate it more into the development of biomarkers in order to make sure that we're able to make accurate treatment outcome predictions.
And there's a pretty new field anyway, so there's just lots of work to do and to discover.
Yes. And with the legalization of marijuana, it opens up a lot more opportunities for really controlling for marijuana in the research. Right now, we use observational studies a lot because it's been prohibited for so long. So it'll allow for more control of the impact in the future.
And much larger sample sizes, we can guess. But
yes, absolutely.
So staying in the science theme, Roxana. So it seems pretty unusual to have a crystal that when it changes its hydration, that changes structure in ways that might be reversible. So do you think these materials can undergo maybe a lot of cycles back and forth in ways that would enable them to be used in renewable energy or other applications?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually this observation of that reversibility and, changing the shape and then coming back to its original form driven by humidity, that's really what's happening in the natural water responsive material. So like next time that you're in a forest, you can observe a pine cones that close up and open, and that happens in cycles. The same with wheat elms, they open up and close to propel seeds on the ground. So that mechanism until now was very poorly understood. So, that reversibility is important. And, we were the first one to understand that mechanism. And we really hope that open up to design a lot of materials that are water responsive and powered by water and evaporation.
Very, very exciting work. So, Raj, boy, there are lots of comments. Some people are a little concerned about these robots. Some are very welcoming of the robot overlords. I think that was one comment.
Right.
So the questions, what do you really mean by the notion of common sense? Is that really being able to distinguish between what's a meaningful or a relevant signal and what's noise, or what's common sense mean to a robot?
It's one of those things that you know it when you see it, but you can't define it. And that's the hard part, that people inherently have these common sense principles that you slowly obtain over time. As you grow up through childhood, as you're exposed to your environment, you learn these kind of common sense things. Don't jump into the street because you'll get hit by a car. Don't put your hand on a hot stove. Those are things I can articulate to you, but there are others that are just innate that you observe from the world and you don't do because you've seen it and you've observed it. So the challenge with robotics is if we can't articulate it ourselves, we cannot program it into our robots. And so this is where we've done a lot of work on trying to understand what are some general common sense principles for navigation, which is a smaller problem, and putting that into our robot. And I think it is a very fruitful area to continue this work, because if we want generally intelligent robots, they need to have common sense. If they don't, then they're going to do things that are unexpected and probably unwanted.
And that would apply to people also, right?
People are also not rational all the time. You're absolutely right. So I don't know if we'll get robots that are better at things than people. We do have robots that are machines that are good at certain specific tasks, like I mentioned chess, but more generally, it's hard to get human level intelligence in robots.
Great, thank you, Raj. So Emily, fiddling, really interesting. So have you had a chance to maybe incorporate fiddling techniques in maybe your own performance work, or to inspire maybe colleagues or friends who are composers to think about adding that dimension to their work?
Yeah, well, one thing is that, of course, right now during COVID, performances have obviously been sort of not happening. And of course, that's been the bulk of when I've been doing my dissertation. But my most previous recital, which is not the same one that I actually played Ives's second sonata on, I actually kind of centered it around this idea of fiddling. Like, for instance, one piece that I performed was actually by another living American composer, Jean Criliano, that even more explicitly is about fiddling. It's called Stomp. There's, foot stomping and things like that. So certainly, I certainly really branched out, even in programming my previous recitals about, incorporating this a lot more. And I've considered it, even beyond Ives, again, even in different, even with different composers like Grieg, with Norwegian Hardanger fiddling and that sort of thing. There's definitely a lot of avenues to continue going with this, both in research as well as certainly performance as well.
Really exciting, thank you. Guillermo, so you mentioned that we need to enact more inclusionary policies on a local level. What kind of policies would you recommend for New York City?
Thank you for the and also thanks for questions in the chat. I think that there are a lot of very important local policies already implemented in New York City that other places in the world should look at. But one that comes to mind right now, and based on my work, has to do with licenses for street vendors. I mean, street vending has been a very important activity for immigrants in many places, and particularly in New York. I mean, it's part of this idea of diversity through food, for instance, but also, giving opportunities for have a job. So that might be an inclusionary policy for a lot of people, not only for immigrants, but we know that a lot of immigrants work in this sector. But that's one that comes to mind. But I also would like to say that the New York City ID policy, that's very important. I mean, has a human right to have an identification for people that on their federal or national policies are not part of the of society because of the legal restrictions. I think it's important to consider what already it's there in New York, but also think about other ways to include in terms of economics or in terms of education, and I would say that.
Great, thank you so much. Jojo, I think maybe the last question is going to go for you, and it's a little bit of two-parter. So first part is, did Woolf herself incorporate art or doodles in her missives, or did her sister? And the second part is, your dissertation is really pushing the boundaries of what we think about as a dissertation. And is that the future? What audiences would you might reach beyond your dissertation? What's next for you?
Oh, thank you for these questions, and thank you to everyone. I just have been so excited listening to everyone's research. It's the coolest thing. Woolf didn't really draw. Her sister was the artist and she was the writer, but she did do things like use a standing desk so that she could simulate standing at an easel. So like at periods, like not always, but there were sort of like attitudes of position and where she was in the world. And so for me, the drawing sort of had to simulate that attention to a person's place in relation to the materials that you're using to communicate anything. And in terms of like where I take this, I have been drawing pictures like academics. For instance, I've been drawing everyone as you were speaking tonight. I don't know if it's visible, but I'm really interested in the ways that scholarship is moving forward in terms of data visualization and the ways that people do or don't trust images or interpretation. So for me, a large part of it is like, how do you trust like artistic interpretation as a way of knowing? Because we are confronting across all of our fields this concern with higher education and what it's actually doing to get people closer to facts, and a deep mistrust in how we represent what we see and understand. And so for me, that's like a huge part of it, is like thinking through what our turn to visual culture and our distrust of representation in general has to do, and what, you know, some drawings of people in space can contribute to that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, this is amazing. And there are more questions, but I wish we could get in a few more, but it's just about time to announce the Presidential Prize. So students or graduates, all of you may turn off your cameras and mics now. Thank you. And while they're doing that, I'd like to acknowledge the donors and supporters who've made this showcase possible. With special thanks to longstanding foundation board member and now showcase judge Joanna Migdal for putting this wonderful showcase together, and lots of comments in the chat about really liking hearing from all these different fields all mixed up, and y'all did such a great job communicating their work. Choosing the presenters, helping them hone their presentations. I'd like to thank the Office of Public Programs headed by Karen Sander, and a special thanks to Professor Duncan Faherty, who is the faculty lead for the Dissertation Showcase, and David Olin, the Associate Provost and Dean for Academic Affairs. So thanks to all of you. The judges have made their decision, and I'm honored to announce that we have a tie. So I'm going to read two names and ask both individuals to join us back on the screen and each of them to say a few words. So our two winners of the first Presidential Prize for Public Communication are Natalie Gordon and Jojo Carlin. Congratulations. Please join us back in the room. Yay. And Natalie, you first, please.
Oh my God, I'm beet red. Thank you so much. This is such an honor. I feel like I'm in an incredible group of students, and this has been a wonderful place to get my dissertation from, degree from. So I just thank you. Very honored.
And Jojo.
I mean, I have to second that. I'm just so amazed by everything that we've heard tonight that I feel a little speechless. and it's just, it really has been such an incredibly valuable place to me to be amongst so many brilliant people in such interesting and varied fields. So thank you to the GC, and thank you to everyone.
Thank you. And you're all outstanding communicators. And I know that you worked really hard in your presentations. These skills will serve you well pretty much forever. So congratulations to all of our extraordinary presenters. Their cutting edge research and ability to communicate to the public, well, they're fundamental to doctoral education at the Graduate Center and vital preparation for their careers. So we know that each and every one of them is well on their way. And to the audience, thank you all for joining us to learn about the amazing work that Graduate Center doctoral students have been doing. We can't wait to see what they do next. And audience, we look forward to seeing you live in person next year. Have a great evening. Thank you.